Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Hague program on international cybersecurity seminar series. It's a series in which we ask people with a new publication, usually a book, to sort of come tell us in an hour. The whole thing is wrapped up in an hour. Sort of give us an idea in 40 minutes of what the book is about, why we should buy and read it. Let's put it in that order. Today we're talking to Lennart Maschmeyer, who is a senior researcher at cybersecurity at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. As you're probably well aware, there's a good, buoyant, and interesting crew working there on various aspects of cybersecurity. And Lennart has just published a book on subversion, the strategy of subversion, which is as he calls it, the strategic promise in theory, but also runs into maybe one or two problems when it comes to applying the strategy of subversion into the cyber domain. It has also distinct limitations that may or may not limit its usefulness as a strategy for states in cyberspace. He wrote the book. He literally wrote the book on it. So I would give Lennart the floor. He's going to talk for about 40 minutes, which leaves us with 20 minutes for discussion. Lennart, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks for the nice introduction, Dennis, and thanks for having me. Also, thanks to Korean for organizing this all. I'm excited to do this since, as you just mentioned, the book has just come out, and now I have the opportunity to share it all. I've been working this for a long time. It's come out with Oxford University Press. The title is the same as the talk today. But since marketing is not really my forte, the talk is mostly about what the book is about, not that much about why you should buy it. I hope that just naturally comes from it. So the starting point for this whole project, and that really goes back to 2017, which was a really different time in this whole field, was a really basic but central and also still very much open question, I would argue, and that's how do cyber operations matter in world politics? And most scholarship on this topic in cybersecurity, really what I realized infers the strategic value of cyber operations from distinct properties of the technology used, information communications technologies, that then determine all kinds of outcomes strategically that are possible in theory. But there is comparatively little work that really examines what is also feasible in practice, given what are constraints and challenges involved in producing these outcomes. And scholarship has focused on three main properties of that technology. The first one is speed, high speed of communication of the network, then the large-scale effects that are possible because the internet is global, and the ease of secrecy at the same time, because it's a design that really prioritizes convenience over security. At the same time, the barriers to access are presumed to be really low. Sometimes all you need is a laptop to participate in this kind of conflict interactions. And because of these properties, the expectation is that cyber operations are not only highly effective means of projecting power, but they're also relatively cheap and easy to carry out, which is a win-win scenario, basically, right? And because of that, the expected result of this change is that we have a revolution in the nature of conflict. Disagreement still prevails, though, about the kind of conflict. So first theorizing, starting in the late 90s, really, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this, predicted this kind of rise of cyberwar. So basically, it's about warfare, right? We have a revolution in warfare. We have these fast, disruptive, yet stealthy cyber attacks, strikes on critical infrastructure, similar to aerial bombing. And this is still an influential idea. So the Times, a Newsweek cover here is from just 2 years ago. The Time magazine cover at the start is from the 90s. So this really spans like 3 decades, this idea. In practice, though, those scenarios, fortunately, probably never really manifested, but instead cyber conflict has really been persistently low in intensity, below this threshold of armed conflict. And accordingly, expectations have shifted too. So current scholarship, or majority of current scholarship at least, suggests that cyber operations, rather than changing warfare, open up a new space of interaction below the threshold of armed conflict, where states can now shift the balance of power in ways that they could not do before cyber operations were available. interestingly, though, a lot of this scholarship really rests on the same assumptions of cyberwar theorists about the unprecedented speed, scale, and at the same time secrecy of cyber operations. And the most influential work in this is really from Michael Fischer-Keller, Richard Hartnett, Emily Goldman, the book that recently came out, this idea of cyber persistence theory, and the strategy that the US has adopted already based on this theory. And so basically the idea is you have more with less. And as I said, there is already a strategic shift. And all of this is plausible, right? It's an absolutely plausible theory. But the thing is, it's mostly based on what's possible in theory. There is relatively little evidence that confirms this fundamental shift in practice. And what we see in Ukraine, one of the main case studies, or the main case study in the book really, clearly challenges some of these assumptions. A lot more on this later, obviously. So in short, I'm arguing there has been really a persistent mismatch between the expectations concerning the strategic value of cyber operations in theory, and then what they can achieve in practice, what we observe that they have achieved in practice. And I argue that this mismatch really reflects a lack of theory kind of in the middle ground on how cyber power works and the operational level of cyber conflict where states use it to produce outcomes. And accordingly, also relatively little empirical work on that question. And especially then, given this expectation that we have a revolution in the nature of conflict, it's striking that there isn't actually any work out there yet that systematically compares traditional operations short of war with, cyber-enabled operations of the same kind to see what has changed. And that's what I'm doing with this book, what I see as the main contribution of it. And to build this theory, right, of cyber power, I again start with a really basic question, and that's what's a cyber attack? Most generally, that is an incident that's caused by a cyber operation, which in turn I define simply as different varieties of politically motivated hacking. And hacking, and here it gets interesting, ultimately refers to the secret exploitation of vulnerabilities in computer systems to gain unauthorized access to them and then manipulate them to do things they're not supposed to in the most simple sense. And what that means in practice is, right, you have hackers from Russia, since that's also the favorite villain usually, say they run a cyber operation against the US and target some infrastructure in the eastern US, manage to gain access to it, compromises, and then manipulate that infrastructure in a way that harms the interests of the US. So, for example, by sabotaging some industrial facility, the typical cyberwar scenario, right? Or something more mild, just disrupting private sector firms. So that means ultimately they're using these systems that belong to the US, their own capabilities, right, to produce power, project power, produce an outcome that harms the US, which is really the opposite way to how we usually perceive power or conceptualize power in international relations, where you use your material capabilities, project them against your adversary to compel them to your will. That's the nature of warfare. And since this mechanism really escapes established conceptions of power, I mean, I've argued in an article that the best way to capture it is probably reversing structural power. But because it's such an unfamiliar way of projecting power, it might seem as novel, really, as a technology that it targets. But that novelty really only persists if you don't really, if you only limit your focus on warfare and this kind of conventional conflict that we know. And there is a whole world of shadowy projection of power out there already that's just not very well studied, and that's subversion. And the argument in the book is obviously, if you broaden the kind of conceptual focus that way, things kind of fall into place relatively easily. And we see that cyber operations are best conceptualized, best understood and explained as new means to implement strategies of subversion. Subversion, since it hasn't been studied very much, also lacks theorizing. So again, I'm starting with building a theory of subversion. Basically, to develop a theory of cyber power, I first have to develop a theory of subversion, which in general is about secret and indirect interference in adversary affairs. Strategically, then it belongs to the world of covert operations, so intelligence operations that actively interfere in adversary affairs rather than just passively collecting intelligence. and of the non-military kind. So this is not about secret warfare, which is also part of covert operations. The defining feature of subversion is the mechanism of action that I already talked a bit about. It's about exploitation and manipulation, using vulnerabilities in systems to secretly gain access to those and then manipulate them to produce unexpected effects that benefit the sponsor of an operation and harm the victim. And traditional subversion has targeted social systems, institutions in a state, but also entire societies. And the vulnerabilities targeted are both individual pathologies, someone being lonely, for example, but also flaws in organizational rules and practices like, security precautions. So to put this all in a practical context, right? Imagine the Cold War, and you have the Soviet KGB dispatching an undercover spy to the US. That's something that it's been infamous for, under a false identity, who then manages to gain employment at an industrial facility, so a social organization that maybe supplies the US government with communications technology, keeping in the kind of technology context here, and does so by duping some lonely employee to trust them, and succeeds because there aren't enough background checks of new employees. So that spy is now in place in this facility, has some access to machinery, and can start this manipulation of machinery in a way that then undermines maybe productivity or changes the design of equipment in a way that harms the US to the benefit of the Soviet Union. And again, is basically using this organization, this facility belonging to the US, to turn it against the US itself and produce harm. So the parallels to cyber operations in this kind of mechanism should be clear by now, right? It's both about secret exploitation and manipulation of systems. The systems differ. Traditional subversion is going after social systems. Cyber operations go after computer systems. That means the vulnerabilities also differ. Cyber operations can, on the one hand, exploit the same type of social vulnerabilities that traditional subversion does. So, individual flaws, security practices in organizations, but also vulnerabilities in the technology itself. So design flaws in hardware and software. The mechanism, though, and that's the crux of the argument here, works fundamentally the same way. And that's why cyber operations are best understood as instruments of subversion. And having established that similarity and that theory, right, then the question, if we want to explain how cyber operations matter, the central question then becomes, how does technological change, the rise of ICTs, alter the quality of subversion as an instrument of power? And I define that in the book based on the mechanism of action that we already discussed, the strategic promise also that's involved and the role, and the constraints and practice and the value that results from it in reality. Strategically, subversion has and can fulfill two complementary roles. The first one is as an independent role, as an independent standalone instrument in world politics, so an alternative to warfare when diplomacy falls short, but can also be used as a complement to other instruments of power, most importantly force to facilitate the use of force. Or maybe if subversion fails as an independent instrument, states might also use force to still get what they want, which we saw in Ukraine in the most terrible way recently. The promise that a subversion delivers, that makes it an extremely attractive instrument, because this indirect and secret nature of, or the mechanism of action, mean that ideally it's a cheap, easy, and yet effective alternative to war. Secrecy lowers the escalation risks in subversive operations compared to using force, but the indirect use of adversary systems at the same time also lowers the resource costs compared to using your own capabilities, sending your material capabilities into the field. So that means ideally, it really promises a way to win without war, which is also the fear, right, that many have had also throughout the Cold War of, if you're the victim of subversion, you might not even realize until it's too late. And the parallels to current expectations around cyber operations and, this kind of persistent engagement fear of, cumulative effects over a long time are really striking here. But if this is a way of winning without war, right, then the question becomes, is this a silver bullet, right? And if so, why do states still go to war if, there is this highly effective instrument? And that's the part of subversion and also of cyber operations that hasn't really been researched this systematically. because the same characteristics, as I'm showing in the book here, is the same characteristics that enable the strategic promise, the secrecy and indirect action, they also often preclude the fulfillment of that promise in practice, because they're not given characteristics, but they require really significant efforts to attain and also maintain, that then constrain the effectiveness of subversion in three main ways. The first is speed, because subversive actors depend on identifying vulnerabilities in systems, develop means to exploit them, manipulate them. That always takes time. It's about learning how a system functions that someone else has designed. And that is not something that can be bypassed usually, right? So learning is just by itself something that limits the speed of these operations. You can go faster, of course, but then you lose out. And I'll say more about that on the next slide. The second constraint is in the intensity of effects, because to produce effects, whatever effect you want to produce, you have to first identify a suitable system, something that can produce that kind of effect, and then also has vulnerabilities that you can exploit, and then obviously, develop those means. So that means the kind of ceiling of the effects you can achieve is limited by the availability of systems and your ability to exploit them. But the additional problem is that victims can neutralize subversive operations, cyber operations as well, relatively easily once they discover them. And by arresting a spy, deleting malware, that means you have to tread carefully. And this, again, means you limits the types or intensity of effects you can achieve without being discovered and then losing access. And that risk of discovery finally highlights the third constraint here, and probably the most fundamental one. And those are the limits of control that you have, because effects depend on making systems do unexpected things. But the same applies to you as a subverting actor here. The system might just behave differently than you expect, and you can't really test the effects usually because you would alert the victim to your present. So you may either fail to produce the effect you want or produce unintended consequences. And these efforts, these challenges, they don't only exist individually, but as I already alluded to a little bit before, they interact in a way that confronts subversive actors with a set of trade-offs that ultimately pose a trilemma to them. It's a trilemma because at a given level of resource investment, so basically holding all equal, right? The more actors try to improve on one of these three variables, speed, intensity, and control, and that's what the diagram here illustrates, the more they tend to lose out on the remaining ones. At best, they can really maximize 2 out of these 3 variables, and usually that comes at the complete loss of the remaining ones. So to illustrate, right, imagine there's an actor who wants to proceed very fast. That means there is less time compared to spending, or going slower. There's less time for reconnaissance and development. That means you will know the target system less well. Your means of exploitation will be less sophisticated as well. So that the chance of something going wrong increases, the loss of control, and the intensity of effects you can achieve reliably, especially, that tends to decrease at the same time. So now if you imagine maximizing both speed and intensity, then the loss of control of, something going wrong, of just being discovered, continues to increase so much that there's a very high chance that you're just going to fail. And it's because of these trade-offs that in practice, contrary to this great promise, subversion and cyber operations are usually too slow or too weak or too volatile to produce strategic value and fulfill their promise. So much to the similarities between cyber operation and traditional subversion. So let's talk a bit about the differences, right? And the first key difference is in the strategic scope of these types of operations. Classic literature on subversion shows 3 types of strategies, going nicely in line with the 3s we already had. The first one is manipulation, which is about manipulating government policy either directly through infiltration or indirectly by manipulating public opinion. Good example here is Günther Guillaume, who's on the right on the photo, who used to or managed to become one of the closest advisors of Willy Brandt, former German chancellor. And 3 years into Brandt's term as a chancellor, was discovered to be an East German spy who, had this highest level access at the German government. The second strategy is much broader and diffuse, and that's about erosion. undermining social cohesion in a state, sabotaging infrastructure and institutions. It's not about specific policy change, but it's rather about generally weakening your adversary, shifting the balance of power ideally. The third most dramatic subversive strategy is overthrowing a government, either by infiltration, so coming out of manipulation strategies as well, if you can mount an internal coup, create a faction that topples the government, but also through an external revolt or, orchestrated through proxy actors. Now, if you think about cyber operations, right, as a means of a subversion, realistically, they can only really implement these erosion strategies as long as, and I hope it's a bit longer, we are not governed by computers. You can't overthrow governments with cyber operations alone. And the same with the manipulation strategies. They can certainly facilitate, contribute to it, but you will need humans in the field. So the strategic scope is more limited, clearly, compared to traditional operations. Similarly, cyber operations also have less scope of impact. That in this context refers to the type of effects cyber operations or subversive operations can achieve and the intensity on targets. Scale, on the other hand, refers to the number of targets affected and their geographical spread. And traditional subversion has a clear advantage if you think about it in scope because of the flexibility and just capabilities of spies. They're humans who exist in the physical world, can produce physical outcomes directly, breaking into something, placing a bomb, starting relationships with people, hurting them, and so on. Whereas cyber operations always have to go through computer systems, right? You have that limitation of finding a system that's actually able to produce the effect you want. So traditional subversion has an edge here. Cyber operations, on the other hand, have a clear advantage in the scale of effects because it's a global network and because the agents they use, mostly computer viruses, are immaterial and can also proliferate instantly and infinitely, really. So to sum this up, traditional subversion has an advantage or a greater strategic scope, more pronounced strategic role, better impact. Scope of impact is much better for it. But on the scale of impact, the scale of effects, that's where cyber operations really shine. I test this whole theory in the book by comparing two most similar cases. The one is the KGB's campaign against the Prague Spring in the 1960s, and then contemporary Russia's campaign against Ukraine. And these are most similar cases because, they are similar in almost all important ways, except for the technology being used, which in the Cold War case is traditional subversion using spies that infiltrate the country. And against Ukraine, Russia obviously also using quite a bit of cyber operations. So to give you a short background of the Cold War case here, in January 1968, a liberal politician named Alexander Dubček became the boss of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, where he started a series of reforms to what he called give communism a human face. That was a huge threat for the Soviet Union because it feared losing Czechoslovakia to the West. And to prevent that outcome, they pursued two main goals, they being the Soviet. The first one was to reverse this liberalization movement under Dubček. And the second one was to just undermine also an auxiliary goal here, obviously, undermine domestic support for these liberalization policies. And to do that, and that's something that's really underappreciated in a lot of the historical narratives around this case, because many of you might know that ultimately the Soviets invaded, to give you the spoiler first. But before that, they mounted this really massive subversive campaigns, one called Progress, the other one Chodoki, that were about infiltrating and manipulating and disintegrating civil society, but also infiltrating the government. Some of these operations were really wild. The worst one really was a plot to assassinate the Russian spouses of civil society members to make it look as if there was this anti-Russian sentiment. Fortunately, that was abandoned at some stage. So to just give you an idea, I obviously can't go through all of these cases here of what the Soviets tried, achieved, didn't achieve. I'll just quickly outline 3 operations from before, during, and after the invasion that ultimately happened here. So the main operation that happened before the invasion was really a disinformation deception exercise. As part of the strategy to discredit the civil society liberalization movement in Czechoslovakia, Soviet propaganda throughout 1968 really was warning of this CIA-financed counter-revolution in Czechoslovakia, led by liberal members of civil society. And to back this up, a KGB undercover agent, under a cover as a journalist, placed American-made weapons in an underground arms cache that was then discovered very conveniently by a journalist for the main communist newspaper in Russia, Pravda, on the next day, who then turned it into headlines. There was a problem, though, because Czech journalists also looked through the evidence here and noticed that these weapons had all been placed in bags that were produced in the Soviet Union, which meant, there was a clear kind of ticket here of where it came from. And in response, Czechoslovakia's interior minister produced or published a really strong rebuttal the next day. And that also meant that most people in Czechoslovakia never bought the study. On top of that, later investigations turned up that this KGB agent in question had only arrived in Czechoslovakia a few days before he placed these weapons, and then also went to the scene in the official car of his newspapers. That his newspaper in Czechoslovakia, some of his colleagues obviously noticed this coincidence, right? So no one believed the fabrication in Czechoslovakia, but in Moscow it became established wisdom. So overall, at least in the Czechoslovakian context here, you see this pitfall of high speed, only a few days to prepare it, and then high intensity placing weapons, material things, and resulting in basically losing cover here. At the same time, in parallel, the Progress Operation was, other agents of the KGB were involved in infiltrating the government of Dubček to create this pro-Soviet group of politicians within it. It was led by Alois Indra in the center of the image here. And this group was then supposed to mount a coup internally exactly at the moment when the Soviet forces invaded, who invaded because their subversive operations so far had fallen short of getting Dubček to change course. So the plan was to remove Dubček with a no confidence vote at the same time as the tanks started rolling over the border. But unfortunately, those pro-Soviet politicians here, they missed the timing, probably confusing the time zones between Moscow and Prague, and then were simply too late. On top of that, they also couldn't muster the votes they needed, so they lost the vote. It completely failed. And again, we see that most likely here, speed was the problem, or the lack of time to prepare this and have a deep infiltration of the government. These agents were very confident that they had the influence to get this vote through, but in practice they didn't, and the whole thing completely collapsed. Dubček remained in power even after the invasion, making it much harder for the Soviets to then establish control. The most consequential operation likely happened a year after, in 1969. That ultimately also contributed to Dubček's resignation. So here the context was the ice hockey championships, the finals of the World Ice Hockey Championships, where the Czechoslovakian team beat the Soviet team. And people in Czechoslovakia just freaked out. There were huge celebrations in the streets, but also some people started rioting. And one key target of these riots then became the head offices of the Soviet airline Aeroflot in Prague, which were almost completely destroyed. That's on the photo here, actually. And in his own memoirs, Dubček then mentioned that they had noticed there were these conveniently placed stones right near this office, and also Soviet agents within the crowd who actually started throwing these stones to incite the violence. So to Dubček, this showed a clear willingness to escalate violence by the Soviets and led him to decide to resign in response to prevent further bloodshed. There isn't more tangible evidence confirming whether this was indeed Soviet-sponsored or not. It's definitely plausible. And if it was, then it really had the most impact on Czechoslovakian politics of any of these operations involved here. So it shows subversion can work, and Dubček was ultimately replaced. So putting this all in perspective, overall, though, subversion really fell short on all fronts. The Soviets had hoped, and there was a note also found on Khrushchev's desk saying that they were hoped, so the Soviet leader's desk, right, that they hoped to avoid invasion with these subversive operations. Obviously fell short, didn't achieve that. We saw the invasion, and ultimately also the need to keep the whole country occupied for the rest of the Cold War, when they had expected to only do a very short occupation, because all their subversive operations failed to establish control in the country. The Ukraine case, now the contemporary case, shows very similar limitations despite the change in technology, but also on top of that, interestingly, the relative edge that traditional means have over cyber sabotage, cyber subversion operation. It's both a useful and important case because, at least until February 2022, Ukraine has really been the paradigmatic case of cyber-enabled hybrid war, aggression short of armed conflict, also involving one of the leading actors in this type of conflict. So if cyber operations are really as effective as current wisdom predicts it is, then this would be where we would most expect to see this effectiveness in action globally. Short background here also on Russia's goals. Russia really pursued two main goals here, very similar to what we saw in Czechoslovakia. It's about reversing Ukraine's pro-Western foreign policy that it started in around 2013, and also undermine domestic support for this foreign policy. Used a range of instruments, including also cyber operations, which obviously I'll focus on here. And again, this is just a kind of snapshot of a few operations, not all of the ones covered in the book, just to give you an idea of the kind of patterns overall. So the first operation was an attempt in 2014 to disrupt Ukraine's elections by disrupting the vote counting of Ukraine's Central Elections Commission. And it did that with a virus that deleted all data on these machines just a few days before the elections, basically disabling them for several hours. Only for several hours rather than days, because the victims were able to restore service very quickly because they had backups in place that apparently these hackers had missed or failed to consider. And because of those backups, because the service was back, there wasn't really any impact on the elections here whatsoever. Vote counting happened without problems. Second operation, far more dramatic, also received a lot of coverage in Western media, disrupted Ukraine's power grid through a cyber operation, plunging hundreds of thousands of people in Kiev into darkness just a few days before Christmas in 2016. And to do this, the hacking group Sandworm had developed a really advanced malware that was in theory capable of physical destruction by overloading the grid. And that's also what most of the coverage focused on. But in practice, this very advanced stuff, this very advanced malware failed to achieve that effect because the hackers had missed something really basic. These industrial control systems that they had targeted, they reversed IP addresses. So the commands to blow things up just went nowhere and nothing happened. Instead, they manually disconnected the compromised substations in the same way that they had done a year earlier in 2015. There was a very similar sabotage operation where they basically only through access to the control systems could manually enter these commands. They did this again, the power went off, but only for 75 minutes because the victim had learned from this previous year's operation and was able to restore power very quickly by just switching flicking a switch to manual control. Ultimately, this outage was very short, happened at midnight when most people were asleep, so the impact was also really minimal economically and psychologically. In contrast, NotPetya, the third operation I'm discussing here, really had a huge global impact. It was a self-spreading virus that irreversibly encrypted all data on affected machines, like ransomware, also showed this fake ransom note that spread widely in Ukraine's private and public sector, where it caused significant economic damage and also disrupted public life. So, for example, here you see supermarket checkouts disabled with this ransom note, ATMs, same story. And even the ticketing machines on the subway in Kiev were affected and didn't work, but that in practice meant most people could ride the subway for free. The subway was still going. Ultimately, this virus and the disruption it caused, though, spread far beyond Ukraine, affecting 65 countries globally. But then, as forensic evidence showed, this was almost certainly unintended because this malware had gone out of control. Leading back to the key questions that I raised at the beginning, right? The limits of control and the trilemma. So putting these operations into that context, we see these trade-offs very clearly in action here. So the first operation, election interference, was relatively fast, only 3 months. Medium intensity of effects, just to briefly say why I'm using Locke Johnson's escalation letter for covert operations here, and this type of effect is right in the middle of it. And they lost control because they didn't have enough time to prepare. They missed the existence of backups. Power grid operation in 2016 on a very different end of the spectrum here because they pursued really maximum intensity of effects. And because of that, had to proceed very slowly. This took overall 31 months of preparation to get to the stage where they could attempt to disrupt it that way. And still, as I mentioned, that manipulation failed to produce the intended effect, this physical destruction, and was also quickly neutralized by victims. They lost control here, again, ultimately after only 75 minutes. NotPetya finally maximized both speed and intensity. It was relatively fast, took only around 6 months of preparation. And the intensity of effects was high because it maximized the scale, the perceived advantage of cyber operations, right? Basically global destruction. But as I mentioned, that came at the cost of control loss that led to not only collateral damage, but also direct costs to Russia because this virus spread to Russia, even affecting its oil giant Rosneft, so producing some costs for Russia itself, which makes it uncertain whether this actually produced strategic value for Russia. So there was clearly a relevant impact economically on Ukraine, in contrast to the previous two operations, which has no impact. But whether it's a net gain for Russia, that's very uncertain. So to sum this up, these operations have really provided minimal strategic value overall for Russia. There is little measurable contribution towards its goals. And that also reflects the overall failure of this entire hybrid war strategy, right? Contrary to the expectation that states can now shift the balance short of war, that's exactly what Russia failed to achieve here. And Russia is supposedly the master of this kind of strategy. Because it failed, Russia invaded. And in the run-up to that invasion in 2022, this whole cyberwar narrative surfaced again. I'm sure you've seen the headlines too, right? I'm giving you some examples here of the first real cyberwar in the world, and it's not going to be only a danger for Ukraine, but actually possibly a threat for the whole global system. None other than Keith Alexander, former head of the NSA and US Cyber Command, warned in that year. That didn't happen though, fortunately, right? We are still here. There has been a lot of cyber activity, really, but very little that's been consequential for the course of the war or achieving Russia's core goals. Really, most of the activity has been what you would classify as a nuisance in world politics. So this first activity was a string of website defacements early in the war, posting this warning that was basically inconsequential for Ukrainians who are very much used to this kind of stuff. And then waves upon waves, they're still ongoing, of relatively quick to make disk wipers that still had relatively limited disruption. The scale was very limited, which is interesting because it also shows clear efforts to avoid this kind of control loss that happened with NotPetya. Then one potential exception, the Viasat satellite communications disruption at the time of the invasion that affected military communications, but as later evidence showed, almost certainly did not affect military operations themselves because they had different communications channels. So very little kind of measurable strategic gain here, right? Sure, this caused some disruption for people, but nothing that would count kind of as a strategic gain for Russia. In contrast, traditional sabotage in that, or since the start of the war, from what we can see at least, has produced really measurable strategic gains. The most dramatic one being the takeover of the Chernobyl nuclear ruin, which is in a strategic location and also is a strategic place itself because of the danger that emanates from it. That turned out was possible because of a long-planned subversive operation where Russian intelligence had infiltrated the security forces at Chernobyl that then handed over basically the facility to Russian forces without the need for any fighting. And there's also a lot now of anecdotal evidence in news reporting in Ukraine that shows or indicates that there's been a really broad subversive campaign using bribing local politicians, using corrupt ones, to then facilitate the invasion. There's an example of a mayor of a town who was personally tearing down defensive structures. So all of this, brings the tangible gain of territorial conquest in contrast to the cyber operations we've seen. So taking a step back, right, the conclusions that follow from this, if I'm right, if this theory is right, which of course I think it is, what are the consequences? First, to sum up the argument, right, that the main point is subversion has not fundamentally changed with the rise of information technology. It still remains mostly too slow, too weak, or too volatile to produce significant strategic value in most circumstances, not always. It can produce value, of course. Cyber operations also do offer new opportunities to produce these large-scale effects, but they're also more strategically limited. They also present more challenges, new challenges to really limit control. And finally, from this follow 5 implications for world politics. The first one is that subversion will likely remain an attractive yet ineffective means of power, because even if the limitations become more apparent, states are still likely to use it since it does promise a low risk, potentially high gain option. It's always worth trying, right? Especially if the alternative is war. That same logic also means that even though subversion aims to destabilize countries it targets, its role overall in world politics is likely to be stabilizing rather than destabilizing, because its very purpose is to avoid escalation. By making that choice, states signal restraint. Ironically, though, the same challenges around control that also limit the strategic value of subversion against intended targets also raise the risk of collateral damage and unintended outcomes. And that's particularly true for self-proliferating viruses like NotPetya. And here it's interesting that Russia has shown these efforts to control this, the spread of its viruses, right? So this might be kind of self-restraining. Hopefully, as states avoid these effects, we don't see this kind of escalation. Still, this risk of unexpected outcomes also raises the risk of unintended escalation in wartime, especially when it's about targeting critical capabilities or even maybe nuclear weapons, as some have theorized. And finally, the evidence from the book underlines, and I've only briefly alluded to it here, is that traditional subversion not only remains relevant, but has actually more potential to produce significant strategic value. And I think a danger in a lot of the panic around cyber attacks is that it risks distracting from these traditional threats that we see popping up all across Europe now, right? There is more and more evidence of a really widespread Russian campaign of sabotage. But in any case, that's it. I hope I've answered all your questions, but probably not. So I look forward to also any rebukes you might have. And here, finally, the cover from the book.